Think about it. If you have a severe food allergy, you have to be incredibly careful. Strict avoidance is really the only way.
It's a constant vigilance.
And that gets even harder, doesn't it, with our global food supply, especially with imported foods where you might not be totally sure what's what.
Exactly. That fear of accidental ingestion is always there, and it's serious. Accurate labels are just non-negotiable.
Absolutely. If those labels aren't clear or aren't accurate, that safety net just disappears.
Which can have, devastating results sometimes.
So today we're doing a deep dive into exactly that. We're looking at a really comprehensive study on allergen labeling.
Specifically on prepackaged foods imported into Australia, but coming from mainland China.
Right. The study is called A Comprehensive Survey of Allergen Labeling on Prepackaged Food Products Imported from Mainland China.
And you can find it in the journal Food Control. It's volume 123 from 2021, paper number 107749.
We should also mention the authors. Nicki Shwe Yee, Qianqian Shao, that's pronounced Chen, Chatchporn Uraipong, Masahiro Shoji, and Nanju Alice Lee.
Yeah, quite a team. And our goal here is really to unpack what they found. What did this study reveal about how well allergen risks are being communicated on these specific products?
And importantly, what does it mean for you, the person actually buying and potentially eating these foods?
Okay, so let's set the stage a bit. Food allergies are a huge public health issue globally, we know that.
Yeah, reactions can be severe, even life-threatening anaphylaxis from just tiny trace amounts, so avoidance is key.
And in Australia, you see a lot of food products from mainland China, right? In regular supermarkets, Asian grocery stores, they're everywhere.
So there must be rules about labeling them.
Oh, yes. Australia has the Imported Food Control Act, 1992, and the FS&Z Food Standards Code. They mandate labeling for the big allergens: peanuts, tree nuts, milk, eggs, sesame, fish, shellfish, soy, wheat, lupins.
And it's the importer's job to make sure those labels are compliant.
Correct. The responsibility falls on the importer based in Australia.
But the study pointed out a sort of mismatch, didn't it, between Australian rules and rules in China?
That's a really important piece of context. Historically in China, under their standards like GB 771RD 2011-50EVN, declaring allergens was mostly voluntary.
Oh, okay.
Now that's changing. There are draft regulations moving towards mandatory. But that difference creates complexity when goods move between the two systems.
And even if manufacturers are trying their best, using things like GMP or HACCP,
good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and critical control points, yeah. Even with those systems in place, cross-contact can still happen.
Right, allergens unintentionally getting into products.
Which leads manufacturers to use what's called precautionary allergen labeling. You'll see it abbreviated as PAL.
Like may contain traces of.
Exactly, that kind of thing. It's a voluntary warning about potential unintended allergens. But here's the catch. PAL isn't strictly regulated. Not in Australia, not in China.
So it can be inconsistent.
Very inconsistent. How it's used, when it's used, even how it's worded.
Okay, but isn't there a tool in Australia to help standardize this a bit? VITAL?
Yes, VITAL. Pronounced V-I-T-E-L. It stands for Voluntary Incidental Trace Allergen Labeling. It's a risk management tool from the Allergen Bureau here.
What does it do?
It helps companies assess the actual risk of cross-contact and decide if PAL is genuinely needed based on that risk. The study uses VITAL's action levels.
Action levels?
Yeah, basically thresholds. Action level 2 is the key one here. If the assessed risk hits that level, VITAL recommends using PAL. It's based on reference doses, tiny amounts likely to cause a reaction, like 0.2 milligrams for peanut, egg, milk, or 1 milligram for wheat.
Okay, so that gives us the background. How did this study actually investigate the labels and the food itself?
It was a two-pronged approach. First, they did a big label survey.
Looking at the packages.
Right. 429 different products imported from mainland China, bought in Sydney stores between 2016 and 2017. Covered 14 different food types.
And what did they record?
Everything on the label. Ingredients, any allergen summary statements, any PAL statements. They noted the language, English, Chinese, both, and whether the label info came from the manufacturer or was added by the importer.
So a thorough look at what consumers actually see. But they didn't stop there.
No, they went further. They took a subset of those products, 66 of them, and did lab tests.
Using what method?
Using ELISA, pronounced ELISA, Enzyme-Linked Immunosorbent Assay.
Okay, what does ELISA do?
It's a standard lab technique that can detect and, importantly, quantify specific proteins, in this case, allergen proteins.
Which allergens did they look for with ELISA?
They tested for 4 key ones: peanut, egg, milk, and wheat.
And the process is basically prepping the sample and measuring the allergen.
Yeah, in simple terms, you homogenize the food, extract the proteins, then use these specific ELISA kits that bind to the target allergen and give you a measurement of how much is there.
And those ELISA results, the actual measured amounts, were then compared back to the vital system.
Exactly. They use the ELISA numbers to see if a product exceeded those vital action levels we talked about.
So they could classify them.
Right. Low risk below action level 1 probably doesn't need PAL according to vital, or high risk exceeding action level 2, where vital says PAL is recommended.
Okay, let's get into the findings then. What did that initial label survey show? How good was the basic compliance?
Well, on the surface, pretty good actually. About 93.5% of the products had English labels and seemed to generally meet the basic FSANZ standards.
And the mandatory part, listing allergens in the ingredients or a summary box.
That was a bit lower. Around 73% complied with those specific Australian mandatory requirements.
73% still leaves over a quarter that didn't fully comply with mandatory declaration.
That's right. But there was another issue you flagged earlier, language.
Ah, yes, the Chinese-only labels.
Even though most had English or were bilingual, they found 6.1% of ingredient lists and 6.3% of allergen summaries were only in Chinese, put there by the manufacturer.
Mostly in the Asian grocery stores, you said.
Primarily, yes. And if you can't read Chinese, that mandatory information is completely inaccessible. That's a definite risk.
What about the voluntary PAL statements, the may contain warnings? How common were they?
They found PAL on 22.1% of the products they surveyed, so roughly 1 in 5.
And were those always in English?
No, and this was another major concern. Of all the PAL statements they found, almost 1/5, 19%, were only in Chinese. No English translation provided by the manufacturer or the importer.
So again, an English-reading consumer would just miss that warning entirely.
Completely miss it. A potential hidden risk.
And the wording of PAL varied a lot too, I gather.
Oh, definitely. They found 9 different phrases being used.
9? Wow.
Yeah. Most common were may contain traces of.
Yeah.
It was on about 28% of the PAL labels and manufactured in a facility that processes on about 25%.
And you mentioned Vital recommends specific wording.
Yes, Vital recommends may be present. But interestingly, none of the products surveyed use that specific phrase.
Any other issues with the PAL wording?
Minor things, like slight differences in meaning between the Chinese and English versions on the same package, sometimes due to translation choices by the importer.
Okay, so that's the labels. Often present, sometimes incomplete or language barrier issues, and inconsistent PAL. Now, the really crucial part. What did the lab tests find inside the food?
This is where it gets quite revealing. The ELISA testing on those 66 products, well, over half of them, 51.5%, had detectable allergen residues.
More than half contain allergens they weren't necessarily supposed to?
Detectable levels, yes, ranging from really low, 0.7 parts per million, up to quite high, nearly 300 ppm in one case. It shows cross-contact is definitely happening.
And when you apply the vital risk assessment to those results, how many were high risk?
Using the vital action level 2 threshold,
Yeah.
30.3% of the tested products, so almost a third, contained allergens at levels considered high risk by that standard, levels where PAL would be recommended.
Which allergens were popping up most often at those high risk levels?
Milk was the most frequent, found in 45% of those high-risk samples. Then egg at 40%, wheat at 35%, and peanut at 10%.
And one product could have multiple.
Oh yes, absolutely. That's why the percentages add up to more than 100. A single product might have high levels of both milk and egg, for example.
Okay, so this leads us to the critical comparison. The lab results versus the label. Did they match up? Was the risk communicated accurately?
This is probably the most significant finding and frankly the most worrying. There was a major mismatch.
How so? Let's start with the worst case. High risk found in the lab, but no warning on the label.
Yeah, the underlabeling. They found that 55%, more than half of the products identified as high risk by ELISA and Vital, had no PAL statement at all.
Wow. High risk, but zero warning for the consumer.
Exactly. Looking at the whole tested group, that means 16.7%, about 1 in 6 of all products tested, fell into this high-risk, unlabeled category.
And the levels could be significant.
Yes, they gave an example of wheat residues up to almost 300 ppm in a product with no PAL. That's a serious potential exposure.
A huge safety gap. What about when PAL was present? Was it accurate? Did it list the right allergens found in the lab?
Not always. Even when a product had detectable allergens and a PAL statement, 30% of those cases had undeclared allergens.
Meaning the lag found an allergen at significant levels, but the PAL didn't mention it.
Precisely. The PAL was incomplete or inaccurate.
Can you give an example from the study?
Sure. They described one product where the PAL said may contain egg and milk, but the ELISA test found high levels of peanut and wheat and actually didn't detect egg or milk. Completely wrong warning.
That's incredibly misleading.
Another example. A product had high-risk milk levels detected. The original Chinese PAL from the manufacturer listed milk, but the English PAL added by the importer just left milk out.
So, errors happening at different stages. What about the other way around? Products labeled with PAL that were actually low risk, according to Vital.
That happened too. About 28.6% of the products that tested below the fetal Ashton levels, so low risk, still carried a PAL statement.
Over-labeling, is that a problem?
It's not an immediate safety risk like under-labeling, but the concern is it can lead to warning fatigue. If consumers see may contain on everything, they might start ignoring the warnings, even when they're necessary. It dilutes the impact.
So taking all these issues together, the language barriers, the missing PAL on high-risk items, the inaccurate PAL, the over-labeling, what was the overall risk assessment?
The study crunched the numbers and concluded that across their entire sample of 429 products, about 25.8%, so more than a quarter posed potential risks for allergic consumers due to these labeling issues and the presence of hidden allergens.
A quarter of these imported products potentially risky. What did the author say this indicates?
They suggested it points towards, well, inadequate allergen management systems by some manufacturers back in mainland China, and also potentially some negligence by some Australian importers who aren't fulfilling their legal duty to ensure compliant and accurate labeling before sale.
This seems to have really significant implications, not just for Australia.
Definitely. It highlights a major challenge in global food trade. How do we ensure safety for allergic individuals when regulations and practices differ so much between countries? It shows a clear gap between rules, voluntary actions, and what's actually in the food.
So what's the solution? What did this study propose?
They make a very strong concluding point. The need for harmonized allergen labeling requirements globally, mutually acceptable standards.
Harmonized how?
Standardizing PAL, what it means, when to use it, how to word it, and implementing consistent risk assessment plans everywhere, maybe using validated tools like Vital more broadly.
And the payoff for that kind of global effort.
Clearer rules for manufacturers and importers, which facilitates trade, but most importantly, much better protection for allergic consumers worldwide. Consistent, reliable information they can trust no matter where the food comes from.
So recapping this deep dive into the work by Nicki Shwe Yee, Qianqian Shao, and their colleagues, it paints a complex picture.
Yeah, mandatory labeling compliance is okay-ish, maybe around 73% for the specifics. But the voluntary PAL system is where the big problems lie.
Inconsistent, often inaccurate, sometimes missing entirely even when lab tests show high levels of allergens, and sometimes only in Chinese.
Right. That presence of detectable, sometimes high levels of allergens, without proper warning or with the wrong warning, that's the core risk highlighted. It really underlines why we need better global standards.
It does. So considering these real-world challenges in tracking allergens across borders, how can you, listening right now, best navigate this? How do you use labels effectively, knowing these potential pitfalls?
And perhaps thinking bigger, what needs to change in our global food systems to prioritize truly safe, accurate, and consistent allergen information for absolutely everyone?